For the last couple of years, anamorphic lenses has become more and more affordable. And I thought in this video I'll talk a little bit about the differences between anamorphic lenses and spherical lenses. And we're going to take a look at when you want to use anamorphic lenses and when you want to use spherical lenses. So for the last year, I've been using the Blazer Remus 35mm on various projects, including a feature film. But for most of our projects, I've been using spherical lenses. I even shot 2 feature films on spherical lenses. So what are anamorphic lenses? So first off, the front element of the lens is oval. So that means that the image becomes stretched vertically. So then in post, you need to stretch the image horizontally to make it look normal again. And you can get lenses that are 1.33x, 1.5x, 2x, and that number refers to the amount that the lens is stretched. So if it's 2x, the image is twice as tall as it usually would be, and then in post, you have to stretch it 2 times horizontally. This means that the image will become 1.5 times as wide as a normal spherical 35mm lens. So then if you're shooting on a 16:9 sensor, you get a 2.66:1 aspect ratio when you have de-squeezed the image. So one of the great things for me about anamorphic lenses is that they have quite a unique style. Because you're stretching the image, you get a oval bokeh, which looks very pleasing. And also because there's so much glass inside the lens, you get a more imperfect image. So now that we're shooting on digital sensors, and because of that get a much more digital and clinical image, you can use anamorphic lenses to kind of take away a little bit of that clinical digital look. And because you're stretching the image, let's say you're shooting on a 35mm, you're still getting a 35mm vertically, but let's say you're shooting on a 1.5x lens. You get a 1.5 times wider image while still having the same height. You also get these horizontal lens flares. If you ever looked at a J.J. Abrams film, especially Star Trek, you've definitely seen those lens flares. Some people don't like them. They have a very distinct quality to them. But to me, I think it adds extra character to the image. One of the best use cases of shooting anamorphic is when you know you're going to deliver in an aspect ratio of 239:1. And the reason for that is that if you're shooting on a 16:9 sensor and you want to deliver in 239:1, if you're shooting with a spherical lens, you'll have to zoom in on the image quite a bit. But let's say using a 1.5x anamorphic lens. When you're shooting in 60:9 then, after you've de-squeezed the image, you get a 2.66:1 aspect ratio. So then you only have to zoom in like 10% to get a 2.39:1 aspect ratio. So then if you're delivering in CinemaScope or 239:1, you still get to keep most of the image compared to when you're using a spherical lens. I think one of the main reasons for using anamorphic lenses is because it has quite a cinematic look. And I know a lot of people will roll their eyes when I'm talking about something looking cinematic. But I think when talking about anamorphic lenses, it actually makes sense. And the reason for this is, as mentioned earlier, anamorphic lenses is made for filmmaking. Compared to spherical lenses, which was at first made for photography, anamorphic lenses was specifically made for making films. So anamorphic lenses has a look that is specifically associated with filmmaking. So the great thing about shooting with anamorphic lenses is if you're delivering in 239:1, you get to retain more of the image. It has a distinctive aesthetic to it, and it's also very much associated with filmmaking. And anamorphic lenses can combat the more clinical digital look. Let's get into some of the downsides of anamorphic lenses. First off is the price. Even though, as I mentioned earlier, anamorphic lenses has become much more affordable the last couple of years, they're still quite pricey compared to spherical lenses. I'm using the Blazer Remus 35mm, which is quite an affordable lens compared to other anamorphic lenses. But still, even though it's technically an affordable lens compared to other anamorphic lenses, it still costs nearly $1,000 to buy it. If you compare that to spherical lenses of similar quality, they're much cheaper, sometimes at half the price or even less. And then if you want to shoot on proper anamorphic lenses that they use in Hollywood films, then they can end up costing an insane amount of money. Then I'm talking about a kit literally costing over $100,000, and it's pretty much impossible to buy. The only way you'd be able to get a hold of them is through renting or something like that. Anamorphic lenses also tend to be much larger compared to spherical lenses, and that has to do with the amount of glass that is needed to make anamorphic lenses. So if you have a smaller camera setup, using an anamorphic lens can be quite tedious and can be very heavy, and it's oftentimes much harder to handle compared to spherical lenses. Also, if autofocus is important to you, there are very few options of anamorphic lenses that actually supports autofocus. There are some, like the Blazer Apex, but they're much rarer compared to spherical lenses that has autofocus. And then if you're using a smaller camera, that needs IBIS and you don't want to rig out the camera, then using anamorphic lenses can be an issue. There are certain cameras with IBIS where you're not able to use the IBIS if you're shooting anamorphic. There are some cameras that supports anamorphic IBIS, like the Lumix S5 I'm using right now, and it works pretty great. But if you compare anamorphic IBIS to normal IBIS, the anamorphic IBIS looks much worse and it's much less usable. And that's because of the squeeze, but it also has to do with the sides. There's a lot of funky stuff on the edges of anamorphic lenses, which makes the IBIS much more noticeable. But I've used anamorphic IBIS on the Lumix S5, and I've actually shot a whole feature film doing that. So it's still very much doable, but it's something you have to consider when using anamorphic lenses. Also, when you're shooting with anamorphic lenses, you need to monitor the D-squeeze, and there are certain cameras that don't support internal monitoring. For example, the Sony FX3 only supports 1.33x D-squeeze and 2x D-squeeze, and they don't support 1.5x D-squeeze. So if you have a 1.5x lens and you want to monitor the lens accurately and you're using the Sony FX3, you then have to buy an external monitor. There's also just a lot more distortion, flaws, vignetting, and focus breathing when using anamorphic lenses, which to me is something that I look for when using anamorphic lenses. But for some people, that can be considered a flaw. So I'm now shooting on a 35mm spherical lens, the 7 Artisan Spectrum 35mm. So this is the same focal length as the Blazer Remus 35mm. So I haven't moved the camera at all, but you can see you're getting a lot less information on the sides. So this is a good way to see the difference between anamorphic lenses and spherical lenses, especially when it comes to field of view. So spherical lenses are much more normal lenses. It's what's mostly being used for most content. And spherical lenses does not squeeze the image at all. When you're shooting with it, it just looks normal. And what you see is what you get. So spherical lenses has a much less distinct look. And this can both be an advantage and a disadvantage. Of course, when we're shooting with digital sensors, using spherical lenses can lead to a more digital and clinical look. Spherical lenses tend to be more neutral, but that's not always the case. You do have more vintage spherical lenses, like the Helios 442 and the Voigtlander lenses, which have a much more distinctive look. But in general, spherical lenses has a much less distinct aesthetic. The disadvantage is that it looks more clinical. It can look a little bit more boring. It oftentimes can look a lot less distinct compared to anamorphic lenses. But the great thing about a more neutral lens is that they're much more versatile. So there's a lot more use cases for spherical lenses. You can use it for commercials, you can use it for more corporate work, and the fact that you have a more clean look means that you can do a lot more in post instead of having the look baked in compared to when you're using anamorphic lenses. Another good usage of spherical lenses is if you're delivering in 16:9, because let's say you're using a 16:9 sensor, you then get to use the full sensor, compared to when you're using anamorphic lenses, you would then have to crop in quite a bit. Also, if you're shooting for horizontal and vertical content, spherical lenses is much better for that, because you get a lot more height compared to anamorphic lenses. So if you're doing social media, I think spherical lenses is the way to go for most scenarios. And also mentioned with anamorphic lenses, if you're delivering in 2.39:1 aspect ratio, you should use anamorphic lenses, because you get to retain much more of the image. However, if you're using spherical lenses and you're delivering 2.39:1, you have to crop the image quite a bit, especially if you're shooting with a 16:9 sensor, and even more so if you're shooting with an open gate sensor. But the great thing about shooting spherical lenses and delivering in 2.39:1 is that you have a lot more room to reframe the image vertically. David Fincher, for example, who's made Gone Girl, Fight Club, Seven, and a lot of other great films, he's known for shooting in 16:9 with spherical lenses and then delivering in 2.39:1. And he's known for having perfect camera movements. And what he does is that in post, he will reframe the image because he has a lot more room vertically due to them not using the full 16:9 sensor when delivering the film. So that's an advantage of shooting with spherical lenses when delivering in 2.39:1. Also, something I forgot to mention with anamorphic lenses is that if you have a camera that has a slow readout speed, you should probably use spherical lenses. And the reason for that is because when you're shooting with a camera with a slow readout speed, when you're panning very fast or moving the camera a lot, you get this jello effect. And straight lines become skewed. And when you're stretching the image horizontally, those lines become even more skewed. So when you're shooting anamorphic, the rolling shutter becomes much more noticeable. So that's something to be wary about when shooting with anamorphic lenses, is if you have a slow readout speed. Spherical lenses are also much cheaper compared to anamorphic lenses. For example, one of my favorite lenses that I own is a TT Artisan 40mm f2. This is a spherical lens, And this lens only costs $168. And if you compare that to the Blazer Remus 35mm, that one is around $900. So you can buy 5 of these for the price of one Blazer Remus 35mm. And the Blazer Remus is considered affordable. So if you have a limited budget, I think investing in spherical lenses can be much wiser compared to investing in anamorphic lenses. Because you can get much higher quality with spherical lenses for the same price of anamorphic lenses. And also another great thing about spherical lenses compared to anamorphic lenses is that they tend to be much smaller. If you compare this TT Artisan lens with my Blazer Remus 35mm, this one has a peel adapter on it, so it looks a little bigger. But if you ignore the adapter, it's still much bigger compared to the TT Artisan. So if you want to go out traveling and you want to shoot some footage and you want to have a small, nimble camera setup, then spherical lenses might be better for you. Spherical lenses also tends to be much easier to use. As mentioned with anamorphic lenses, IBIS works much better on spherical lenses. You get a lot less artifacts. There's a lot more spherical lenses that has autofocus compared to anamorphic lenses. And also because of their size, they're much easier to just bring with you. I think you should use anamorphic lenses when you want a more distinct look and you want to deliver in 2:9:1. I think the times when you shouldn't use anamorphic lenses is if you want a more controlled look, you want less distortion, less vignetting, less focus breathing, and also if you have a vertical delivery, you end up losing a lot of information when shooting anamorphic. And you have a lot less options reframing. So in general, spherical lenses are much cheaper, they're much more versatile, but they also do tend to have a more clinical and digital look, especially when using it with a digital sensor. And the great thing about spherical lenses is that you can much easier reframe in post. You get a lot more information vertically, so if you're doing vertical content like social media, spherical lenses might be better for you. And also, if you have a limited budget, spherical lenses tends to be much more cheaper. So if you're starting out and you have a limited budget, spherical lenses might be better for you. So that's my video comparing anamorphic lenses to spherical lenses. Hope this was interesting to some of you. Please do let me know what you guys prefer. See you guys in the next one.